Okay, so this is title of this is Deming 101. I didn't give it this title, but given that I'm here, it's an appropriate title to have, I think, because it is sort of the survey course of Deming. So when I was here before, I got to teach. I'm sure the numbers have changed, but I taught Stat 104 and Stat 105 and Stat 227, and those numbers don't exist anymore, probably. But they're the introductory stat courses for the agricultural students and the engineers and the business students. So I guess that's all I'll say about that. I don't want to say too much. No, but it's the campus is still beautiful. There are some changes, though. I mean, I didn't recognize the name of this building, and I noticed that it was built in 2003. I was here from 1979 to 1983, so I'm one of those damn old farts that comes back to campus, I guess, after being away a long time. But one of the actual striking things for me was all the trees around, Shaman Auditorium and the football field, and those were tiny when I was here before, and now they're all big. I've only grown out. So anyway, so we have a survey course here for Deming. This is good. So what you get is you get the upper division courses later today and tomorrow morning. So this is just as I said, the survey course. Let's see. Oh, I'm pushing the wrong buttons. So overview of the presentation. First, I want to make some observations about where I have seen the system of profound knowledge come from. Dr. Deming, at the end of his life, was articulating his theory as the system of profound knowledge, but that's not what he was articulating when I first met him in 1986. And then so sort of what is it, and then how can we use it to think about business and life? And so that's sort of the ambitious, maybe, objectives for today. So when I met Dr. Deming in September of 1986, it was at a wonderful place. It was a Hotel Del Coronado in San Diego. It was a wonderful place for a seminar, although Dr. Deming hated it. It was he thought the rooms were small and uncomfortable, and they probably were, but it was an incredible place, and it was right on the beach. He didn't appreciate the beach, though, I don't think. Anyway, he'd start his seminar, and he'd basically say hello. He'd say, why are we here? We're here to learn, to make a difference, and to have fun. I mean, how can you talk about statistics topics and not have fun, right? See? We're starting already. It's funny because I was giving a talk once in England, and I told some of my friends I didn't know if my Midwestern sense of humor would translate to England very well. And they said, that's okay, we don't think you're very funny either. So, you know what a statistician is, right? Those people who love numbers, want to make a living using numbers, but really didn't have the personalities to be engineers. All right, so he would start his seminars with like one sentence, and then he would dive in to what were articulated as Deming's 14 points. And I saw everybody have to hold their hands up a couple times already, and I had a question to ask, but I'm going to ask a slightly different question. How many of you, a year ago, had not really any clue who Deming was? There's lots of hands are going up. And I won't ask you how many this morning have no idea who he is. So we'll fix that. So you're the audience for this talk, all right? So he would talk about what he called the 14 points. The first one is create constancy of purpose for management, for improvement of product and service. Adopt new philosophy, whatever that new philosophy is, right? So we'll talk about that. Cease dependence on mass inspection. Into practice of awarding business on the basis of price tag alone. Do any of those sound strange or revolutionary? Maybe not so much yet. Improve constantly and forever the system of production and service. That sounds good. Institute training. That sounds good. Adopt and institute leadership. That sounds good too. So drive out fear, that's, some people aren't sure about driving out fear. Breaking down barriers between staff areas. Why would we put barriers between staff areas? Eliminate slogans, exhortations, and targets for the workforce. Now we're getting a little into places that made managers, I was going to say nervous, but angry. is more like it. So eliminate numerical quotas for the workforce and eliminate numerical goals for people in management. So this is sort of a challenge saying, like, MBOs are not a good idea. If you were there in 1986, you could have watched a lot of experienced managers get quite upset at this point. Remove barriers that rob people of pride of workmanship. There were a variety of statements to this. Most of the common statements have a second half to this. It says, eliminate performance appraisals, merit appraisals is the second half of number 12. And people would really get upset about that one. Encourage education and self-improvement for everyone and take action to accomplish the transformation. So he would basically spend the first 2 or more days talking about these one point at a time. In the middle, he would do the red bead experiment, which you should expose yourself to if you haven't had the experience of seeing that. And then he would also talk about the deadly diseases. He said the crippling disease is lack of constancy of purpose, emphasis on short-term profits is a deadly disease. I'm sure that one's really gone away now, don't you think? No? Polaris makes lots of fun toys, but we also make lots of money every quarter, thank you. Evaluation of performance, merit rating, or annual review. Mobility of management. What's that one about? Running a company in visible figures alone, excessive medical costs, excessive costs of liability. So don't worry, I'm not going to read every slide to you, but these are the things he would spend 3 of the 4 days of his seminar talking about, one topic at a time. And as I sat and listened, people had different reactions to Dr. Deming's seminars. As I sat and listened to him, frankly, when I went to his first seminar, I expected to be bored out of my skull, because I had actually started working for a company that did consulting work in Deming's philosophy. And in preparation for going to this seminar, I'd watched some videotapes. They were awful. They were made by MIT, and they had Dr. Deming standing in an empty classroom writing on a chalkboard. And that's not who he was. He's a person who really enjoyed interacting with human beings. I did a 1-hour webcast thing a month or 2 ago, and that was an incredibly strange thing. Basically doing a lecture to people all over the country, but I couldn't see anybody, and everybody was on mute, so there was no feedback. So you can yell at me and I would be happy compared to that. So it would be very hard to be yourself, and so these were awful videotapes, and I expected that it was going to be a terrible 4 days. And from the very beginning of the time, I didn't even know exactly what it is he said, but he grabbed me in the first 15 minutes, and for 4 days, I was in rapt attention to what this guy was saying and trying to understand. See, for me, I saw it as sort of a coming together of my personal values and my education and training, and so for me, it was really a turning point in my life. I don't mean to say that this should all be, so having said that, I think this is an intellectual message that we need to understand, but I'm telling you, I'm very motivated to help people understand it because of those connections. So I started scratching my head and saying, where in the world did this stuff all come from? Because people talked about Dr. Deming's philosophy. I think it's my next slide, actually. They talked about his philosophy, and they said, the 14 points are Dr. Deming's management philosophy. But when I looked at them, they looked to me like a list of stuff, right? Do this, don't do that. These are good practices. These are not such good practices. So I asked myself, what might be the actual theory that lies behind these statements? Because some of these statements sound like motherhood and apple pie, but some of them are very counterculture. And so where in the world did they come from? And so I struggled with that. in March of the next year, March of 1987, oops, so that's, sorry about that. I went to a Deming seminar for statistician. It was at NYU's business campus, which is right near Wall Street, and it was really a cool seminar. It was a bunch. It was like 150 like statisticians. Talk about an exciting group of people, right? Anyway, we were there, and Dr. Deming was talking about statistics and stuff. He introduced a distinction that I hadn't really thought much about when I was studying statistics over the years. How many of you have had a stat class? I mean, the engineers here or the people in school here, how many of you have had a stat class? All right, and other people, everybody else is here is probably, almost everybody else is here has had a stat class. I didn't pick this up in my stat classes. Even when I was studying for my PhD, I was like, there was this, what do most of the problems look like in stat 104 or stat 105 or whatever? They all start out, let x1, x2 up to xn be a random sample from a normal distribution with some mean and some standard deviation. Does that sound at all familiar to anybody? Anybody shivering and going to get your silver cross out and keep me away? But so that's what all this stuff was about. And Deming, he articulated this distinction of studies. He said, first of all, any purpose of any statistical studies should be to provide a rational basis for taking action. And he made a distinction. He said there are two kinds of studies I want to talk about, and they differ by the action that you're going to take. There's an enumerative study, which is where the action taken is going to be on the frame from which you drew your sample. Now remember SAT 101, 104, whatever. We had a population, and then there was a frame, which was the part of the population that was accessible to us, and then we had a sample that we drew from our frame. So what he's saying is we want to take an action on the frame or population from which we drew our sample. That's what all those let x1 up to xn be a random sample problems were about. However, he also talked about, and so the enumerative, it's a big word, but it means enumerate or count or see what is. The analytic study is a statistical study in which actions taken on the process or cause system that created the frame from which you're getting your data and is going to create more frames in the future. So the action isn't really about the stuff you got today, it's about what you're going to have in the future. So how can we improve as we go forward? This is my sort of paraphrasing of it, and this accomplishes a couple things for me. So first of all, as a good, honorable statistician, I've signed a pledge that I can't give a talk anywhere without having at least one bell-shaped curve on a slide. So there's one. It's not the only one. So the enumerative study is a focus on judging what is. So it maybe judging what is would mean, say, let's take this distribution and let's chop it into pieces and do something with the extreme ends of the distribution. Or, let's say what's above the middle or what's below the middle. Let's do whatever, but it's all about that distribution. Versus the enumerative, the analytic study, where the focus is on improvement, is you're going to gather data from, I should have done this as a further build, we're going to gather data from this distribution, the aim being to learn and to create this distribution, assuming higher is better. All right, so we want to raise the level and reduce the variability. We want to make because if we're in manufacturing, we obviously want to be more on target and with less variation from the target, from the nominal. Okay, so that's an analytics study. So that was sort of a statistically an earth-shaking thing for me, and it probably shouldn't have been. I was a mathematics student as an undergraduate, and I continue being a mathematics student as a graduate student. So anyway, Deming sort of said to me, there's this whole analytic world out there that I had not really thought about very much. Because I left here, and I went to teach at St. Olaf College, a little college in Northfield, Minnesota, for 3 years after I was here. And then I had just left St. Olaf to join a consulting firm, and that's when I met Deming. So I had not really had industrial experience or anything at that point. So anyway, why am I giving you this distinction after I just said what is the theory behind Deming's philosophy? In 1988, I thought the theory behind the 14 points was management should be an analytic problem and we often treat it as an enumerative problem. So there's a little backstory. The footnote says, I presented this idea in a talk delivered at NYU Seminar for Statisticians the next year. So it's in between. I had the opportunity to, as Kevin said, help Dr. Deming sort of be his eyes and ears at a division of General Motors. And we were at actually at a manufacturing plant in Sioux City, Iowa, which I'm pretty sure is probably not a General Motors plant anymore. It was the smallest General Motors plant there was, I think. They made fuel injectors, and Deming was there for the day, visiting the plant and talking to managers and people. And I had roughed out a paper articulating this. The premise was management's an analytic problem, and so I had 5 minutes to share this paper with him at the end of the day. And I shared the idea with him, and he thought it sounded like a sort of an intriguing idea. And so this was 4 weeks before this seminar, and he said, Michael, he said, I want you to come to New York University in 4 weeks and share this seminar, this conference for statisticians. I'll find 15 minutes for you in the schedule. This is like a 2-day conference. And this was on a Friday, and Saturday morning I got a call from a sort of very terse call from the conference organizer, saying, I've been told to create a 15-minute slot for you. So anyway, that's the backstory behind this. But anyway, so for example, the cease enumerative practice might be the third point, which says cease dependence on inspection to achieve quality. The established analytic practice says improve constantly and forever, the system of production and service. But a lot of the management stuff is, the things that were really debatable, 10, 11, 12, deadly disease 3 and deadly disease 5, when I looked at those, Deming was saying, you know what, we do a lot of management judging what we got, rewarding and punishing what we've got, not focus on how do we improve the capabilities and improve our ability to do things better as we go forward. I took it as Dr. Deming was saying a lot of these management practices are not helping build people. They're judging and separating and rewarding and punishing, but they're not fundamentally helping people improve. Versus adopt and institute leadership. So anyway, that was my take on what this theory behind the 14 points was. I was wrong, of course, but maybe not totally wrong, maybe, but certainly partly wrong. Anyway, Dr. Deming, I had a chance to talk to Dr. Deming some, and I, among other people, encouraged him to start thinking about sort of trying to articulate sort of some of the theory behind the 14 points. Because if you went to one of his seminars and you didn't understand one of the 14 points, what did you do? You could ask him a question. If you ever went to one of his seminars, that was a very terrifying thing to do. You could ask him a question, and his response varied anywhere from a thoughtful response to your question to say, were you here this morning? He actually said that quite a bit. But you could ask him the question, but what he would probably do is he'd probably say what he said before. But there were other people at the seminars. The first seminar I attended, there were a couple guys, Ron Mullen and Lou Schultz, who were there, and I would ask them questions offline, and they helped me, because they were helping Dr. Deming with the seminar, helping him in terms of running. He would lecture all day, and then there would be working groups in the afternoon, and they would help with the working groups, and then debrief the working group stuff in the morning to set up for Dr. Deming's next day of lecture. And they would help me try to understand what Dr. Deming was saying, because they would be able to say it sort of in different words than Dr. Deming had said it. But the other thing was, every person you talked to had a different take on what Dr. Deming's philosophy was and what it meant point by point. So there was one authority. It was Dr. Deming. And if you didn't understand Dr. Deming, where did you go for help? So he began articulating his theory, the evolution of system of profound knowledge. He didn't start out by saying system of profound knowledge. he started out by saying profound knowledge. The first seminar I helped him with a number of seminars in this time, and so over a matter of really a few months, this evolved a lot. So his first articulation that I saw in January of 1989, he said, this profound knowledge, I think is what the title he gave it then, consists of knowledge of variation, statistical theory, knowledge of distinction between common causes and special causes. Have any of you taken like SPC classes? What it says is, Walter Shewhart and subsequently Dr. Deming, Walter Shewhart created structures, statistical control charts that create limits but basically separate the noise from the signals. Sort of say, if there's variation within these limits, you should not treat individual values as though they are from fundamentally different cause systems. That's a big problem we have today, by the way. Every variation is meaningful, we think, right? We treat every variation as though it's got meaning. And Shewhart gave us rules to sort of say, here's where you can draw bands and say, if things are within these bands, you should treat them as though they're from just chance results from the same system. An example, in Minnesota, on the radio a month ago, they were talking about, they were saying that 42 people had died in motorcycle accidents so far this year. And they said, that's a terrible thing. This is a terrible thing when 42 people die. And maybe I'm more tuned into it because of Victory and Indian. And they said last year the number for the whole year was only 35. Okay. Dr. Deming once said, if you have a number, next year's going to be better or worse. It's going to be higher or lower. That's like a stat joke. You're supposed to laugh. So if you have a number today and you gather a number tomorrow, it's going to be higher or lower than today. So do you celebrate if it's lower and wring your hands and say, oh my God, if it's higher? Guess what? There's variation. Anyway, so we should be trying to say, let's go, that would be hours in itself. But that's an example of people mistaking that, not understanding the distinction. Knowledge about losses from tampering. And tampering relates to basically treating common causes as special causes usually. Random variation as though there's a specific reason for that data point, which is something we really commonly do. Knowledge about interaction of forces. Knowledge about operational definitions. There are lots of kinds of definitions in this world. Operational definitions are a very specific one that you need to do if you've got something you want to observe and make a judgment and have the judgment in common, as opposed to like lexical definitions and other kinds of definitions you have. And he said he would tell you, Dr. Deming would have told you that operational definitions are really important for doing business and having common understanding between suppliers and customers and things. Knowledge of psychology, knowledge of cooperation, its benefits. That was the first list. And the second list, 2 months later, was much longer. So this is the first half of the list. We'll come back and look at some of the individual things, but there are lots of bullets. It sort of was evolving very rapidly. In his last book, The New Economics, which was published in 1993, he had articulated it as saying this: a system of profound knowledge, he said, the layout of profound knowledge appears here in 4 parts, all related to each other: appreciation for a system, knowledge about variation, theory of knowledge, and psychology. And I think, actually there's another part of the paragraph, and he goes on to say, one need not be an expert in any element to be able to apply this as a system. So the question still is, okay, but what is it? So now I'm going to go back a minute and say, well, so what are some of the things he talks about with these things? What are the elements of appreciation for a system and knowledge about variation and theory of knowledge and psychology? That's where I'm going to talk a little bit about this more complete list. Now, you can study each of those things, and if you read The New Economics, Dr. Deming talks about all those things. But, let's see, knowledge about variation, about tampering, knowledge about procedures aimed to minimize economic loss from these mistakes. Those are those are really variation things. Knowledge about loss functions, in particular the Taguchi loss function, and which quality characteristic is more critical for management to work on. What I would tell you is, it's my belief that this statement is really an interaction of multiple ones of those elements, as is actually most of the stuff in this world. Knowledge of interaction of forces and effective systems on performances of people, that's really, it's a systems thing along with then a bunch of interactions with other elements. Knowledge about production of chaos built on harmless random forces, worker training worker, executives meeting together, yada, yada, yada. There's a bunch of examples there. These are things that Dr. Deming would talk about in his famous funnel experiment, which is sort of the other one besides the red bead experiment he talks about. He talks about tampering. So this is really about systems and variation and other things as well. Theory of knowledge, what does that mean? He's got some bullets there. Experience study without theory teaches nothing. Example, success story study without theory teach nothing. He's pretty harsh about some of these things, right? Plan requires prediction, no knowledge without prediction, and it's about operational definitions. He would say that's a theory of knowledge thing. No number of examples establishes a theory, but one unexplained failure will overthrow a theory. So, so a lot of this is just good, like, logical thinking. I don't know if any of you have ever seen somebody trying to solve a problem and said, well, I actually worked with a plant that made fuel injectors, and they made a lot of these things. They made about 20,000 a day, right? And they would ship them off, and eventually they'd get built up in engines, and occasionally a fuel injector would leak. And the engine plant would take those things out. It was painful when it happened in an engine plant. They would take these leaky fuel injectors out, replace them, and they would put them in a nice little package, and once a month they would send them back to the people who made fuel injectors. And about 20 a month came back. Anybody want to do the arithmetic? It's like 20 a month, about 20 work days a month. Basically one a day. 1 out of 20,000 was coming back with leaks. And the requirement was, you need to find the root cause of every one of these leaks and put in, I love this term, irreversible corrective actions. And the people in the plant were saying, what would cause leaks? And somebody said, you know what? I'll bet it's contamination. Contamination, so in fuel injectors, tolerances are pretty tight. The nozzle opens on the order of like 40 or 50 microns to spray fuel, right? So they said, I'll bet there's contamination in the leakers. So they took leakers apart, and guess what they found? Contamination. So it's like, that's it. So now, what are we going to do? They already built these things, 20,000 a day, in a clean room. So now they're going to have their suppliers add washing processes at the end of their production lines and do all their packaging in clean rooms as well, in hermetically sealed packaging, and send it to them so no contamination can get into the process anywhere. Can anybody hear like dollar signs and ka-ching, 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 So these things are getting way, way more expensive. And then some idiot said to them, well, how many good ones did you take apart and look for contamination? It's like, well, why would we take good ones apart and look for contamination? That's supposed to be funny too. They did, and they found contamination in the good ones too. So the point here is that's sort of a theory of knowledge thing. The presence of something, the presence of something correlative with the defect did not mean that that was causative of the defect. All right, so, all right, you get it, I'll go on. Bottom line is they discovered that they had 2 O-ring suppliers, each of which supplied about 50% of the O-rings, and 95% of the leaking devices came from one O-ring supplier. And they never were able to figure out what the difference was in the O-rings that caused the leak. The durometer of the O-rings was similar. They all met specs. So that's actually, it should have been the rest of the story, but it really wasn't, right? Since there wasn't an end. Okay, but what is it? Come back to this. What is a system of profound knowledge? Well, what I'll tell you it is, oh, this is it. Dr. Deming said, the system of profound knowledge provides a lens, excuse me, it provides a new map of theory by which to understand and optimize the organizations that we work in, and thus to make a contribution to the whole country. The system of profound knowledge is, in fancy terms, it's meta-knowledge. It's not specific knowledge. It's not knowledge of answers. Rather, it's knowledge which leads to questions. It causes you to ask different questions, and then you can use subject matter knowledge to come up with your answers. And so, some of people are saying, what? But I hope to illustrate this, okay? So, if this is the lens of a system of profound knowledge, nice graphic, huh? All right, so there are some questions that this seems to beg. So where did the 14 points come from? I believe they came from Dr. Deming looking through his lens, through a system of profound knowledge, which is his way of looking at the world and saying, what do I see that just doesn't make sense through this lens? So there are several pieces to this. I believe one of the questions is, if you can look through the lens of a system of profound knowledge, as it were, and see the world, what does the landscape look like? What might you see if you looked at the world that way? And that begs, to me, two other related questions, which come from, why doesn't everybody see the world this way? And so I think the other questions are, okay, what's the default lens that other people use when they look at the world? And so what is it they see when they look through their default lens? So I would tell you that, that disagreement is an opportunity. However, sometimes you don't even have disagreement. You have, as Paul Newman said, or as was said in whatever that hot movie was, you know, what we have here is a failure to communicate, right? You can't look at the world the same way, right? So you say something like this, and somebody else says something like this. Well, it's not this and this. You can't, if you're coming at something from different perspectives and talking about the same thing, you might be able to have a reasonable conversation. But if you're on different planes and you have fundamentally different worldviews, how can you even have a meaningful conversation? I would be tempted to say that's some of what happens in the whole political system, but I don't think anybody even tries to go back to what is the worldview. They're just arguing about, and they're arguing, I think, about different things in many cases. I promise that's the most political thing I'm going to say. Although I could say a lot more, but you don't want me to. I guarantee you. So anyway, this is the way we're going to use this. And so what now we're going to use is, okay, so this just outlines these questions. So we're going to use the lens of a system of profound knowledge here to start asking, what does the landscape look like when we look through the lens of a system of profound knowledge? What about the lens of the system of profound knowledge leads to this view? Or why in the world would Deming say this? What does the landscape look like through the default lens of American management? And what about the default lens makes them see the world this way? What are the sort of underlying things? And before we do that, let's go back here for a minute. These lenses, this stuff is, I'm a statistician, so I'm an ultimate relativist. If anybody asks, I don't know if you deal with any statisticians, but if anybody asks a statistician a question, what are the first two words that come out of their mouth? It depends, right? And if they're responsible statisticians like me, they'll tell you what it depends on. Right, because statisticians hardly ever make absolute statements. See how I did that there? Hardly ever make absolute statements, right? The probability is very small that they will make an absolute statement. They can have high degree, never mind. So anyway, this whole lens thing is, from my perspective, I would say, Are there right ways to look at the world? I would say there are different ways of looking at the world. Peter Senge talks about these lenses. If you ever have a chance to read The Fifth Discipline, which is Peter Senge's book, which, oh my God, was written a long time ago now, he talks about something called mental models. He said those are deeply held fundamental beliefs and assumptions which shape the way we see the world. He said, mental models aren't really a problem. We couldn't function without them. If we had to go back to first principles with everything that we were going to do, everything we were going to see, we would be lost. We'd never get anything done. We need to have sort of simplifying structures, simplifying fundamental assumptions, which help us see the world coherently to us. The problem is when those fundamental assumptions become tacit. They lie below the surface, and we are not aware that they're assumptions. We accept them as reality, as fact, as other stuff. So let's talk about this a little bit. Let's use some examples. A simple example might let's use the lens of system of profound knowledge, examine point 4. In the practice of awarding business on the basis of price tag alone, instead minimize total cost. One way to do that might be to work with a single supplier for any item. So what might appreciation for a system, or knowledge about variation, and theory of knowledge, or knowledge about psychology, what might those things, or interactions of those things, how would they inform this statement? Where would this statement have come from? And please, that's not a rhetorical question. What do you think? Somebody can shout out. Why would somebody say this using any of these things? All right, I'll start. I won't keep going, but an example might be, if you have a single supplier, it might simplify the system stuff, and the supply chain issues might be more straightforward. Could be. Yes, go ahead.
Allocation of resources for
So if you're going to work with your supplier for a continuous improvement, continual improvement, you've got one supplier, and you could help one supplier more than you could help another supplier. Yeah, and that's related to the system thing, because a lot of organizations don't accept responsibility. That they don't accept that helping the supplier improve is part of their responsibility. Go ahead. There's
psychology. Once you have more than one supplier, they feel in competition with each other.
And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Okay. Maybe putting a different spin on it, though, if you have a single supplier, they will feel more entitled, or they might feel more loyalty to you. They might feel like an obligation to make sure that they fulfill their responsibilities. But that's a possibility. Somebody over here said something? No, go ahead.
It's far easier to build a productive relationship with one entity as to spread yourself out.
So I don't know if you heard that. It's far easier to build a productive relationship with one organization than with multiple organizations. Go ahead.
It simplifies communication, and it lowers the risk when you're making changes for improvement.
It simplifies communication and lowers risk when you're making changes for improvement. Yep. Go ahead.
Reduces variation in the relationship.
Reduces variation in relationships. And I would say probably if you've got stuff coming from one supplier and one supply chain, one set of processes, maybe the parts, if you're buying parts you'll get, will be more consistent than if you buy them from several people and say what you have to do is meet spec no matter where it comes from. Like the O-rings, right? Yep. Go ahead.
I have a counterpoint and I want you to explain.
All right, so we'll get to the counterpoint. All right, so I'm just trying to say, why in the world would this crazy guy Deming say that? Okay, and I'm trying to help you understand he wasn't crazy. He had a basis for what he was saying, the system of profound knowledge. All right, by the way, the other thing about system of profound knowledge, when he was talking about the 14 points, if that was the end of his teaching, I think his legacy would have been doomed. Because you had to go back to the source. You couldn't independently study the 14 points. I mean, you could, but but what would happen after he died with 14 points is the variation of understanding would grow because he wasn't there to keep to keep the variation reduced in any way. With a system of profound knowledge, he's articulated some intellectual pursuits that, you know what, I guarantee if he was still alive, he would be pursuing, he would be learning every day, he would be trying to apply them better. And guess what? We can all do that too. We can understand more about systems, and we can understand more about psychology and the interactions of those things and all of the other stuff. Okay, so let's do the other part, the counterpoint. We'll get to that. Am I doing something that's making this pop, or it just does that? Okay. So we should have multiple suppliers for any item we should purchase at lowest price tag. It's sort of a counterpoint. Maybe that is maybe that's a common, or maybe that's an extreme statement, but that is an alternative that is accepted. Now, why would people say that? What's the lens behind that? Is that related to your counterpoint?
Yeah.
Okay, what's your counterpoint?
So, keeping price aside, if there are two suppliers, it will be a competitive environment to sell more of their products to the company in hand, and that leads to betterment of the products because you need to have better products.
Oh, it does. See, I don't see that. I don't mean to argue with you, but you're saying so if there are two competitors, they're in a race to see who can improve fastest. And I would say they're in a race to see who can take out the most cost and trying to reduce their price as much as they can, which is not necessarily the same as improving the product. Okay. Yep. But yeah, clearly the whole competition between two suppliers, we can't trust. If we just have one, they could abuse us. They could do bad things to us, and we rely on them too much. So having two, we'd like to have them compete and feel a little insecure, right? I think that's one of the things behind that. Did you have something to say?
You can't depend on any supplier, so you need backup.
Oh, you need to have backup because the suppliers might let you down. And it might not even be their own doing, right? It could be a strike, it could have a fire. One of the things Dr. Deming used to say is, well, if you have twice as many suppliers, guess what? You'll have twice as many strikes and twice as many fires. And mostly when people have multiple suppliers, guess what? If you lose half your capacity, you can't just say to the other one, oh, can you double what you send us next week? Because they probably aren't capable to do that. Go ahead.
So if you look at the rapid changing technologies these days, and components come and go very fast, then to have a single supplier is a very risky thing. So I'm not suggesting, I don't like the ands up there by picking the lowest price tag, but having relationships with more than one, you can measure objectively risk of obsolescence, and that's very real and very costly. By having a single supplier. Okay, so did people hear that? It's so basically saying in this rapidly changing technological world, there's a risk if you have all your irons in one fire that somebody else might come up with new technology and obsolete the technology you're using or whatever. Yes?
It's easier to make the decision based on price tag alone because it takes more time and effort to understand the total life cycle cost. I might want to buy something that the price tag is cheap, but yet I have to replace it 5 times as often, and so it's really not saving me any money. But it's easier for me sitting at my desk to make that decision on price tag.
Right, and so did people hear that? So it's saying that it's easier to make a decision based on price tag instead of trying to articulate total cost of use and things, and it's certainly true. And not only is it easier. Like price tag is concrete. And some of this other stuff people would dismiss as being soft. It's sort of trying to get at life cycle costs and stuff. Because we make decisions before we always understand life cycle costs, right? I don't know about other people. I don't know if other people have experienced with this, but there is actually even a new mnemonic, LCC. What does LCC stand for? Low cost country. We're doing a lot of work with LCCs at Polaris. You could probably tell me what those LCCs are, but anyway. Somebody over here? Yes.
My business is a single source supplier, and so what that does to the whole company, because we know we are our customer's sole source, because we are a molder, so we make the mold for them, and we mold and mold the equipment. Is our business continuity planning has to be top notch. We know that we always have to be working on how we can create the most value. And we look at both our customers and our suppliers as partners, not as adversaries. And it changes the whole makeup of the company.
And so, in terms of planning and in terms, I mean, so you're back talking about this stuff in terms of system psychology. You know, you feel obligations to these people because if they're partners, you have long relationships with them, and you view them probably as friends and honored and trusted colleagues and things. Yeah, so you feel a heavy obligation. Yep, and that supplier, you know, is taking a risk working with you, right? Because there might be new technology, and there might be something else. There might be, you know, somebody else might have a better way. Yep. So my point isn't to say, here's the answer about single source supply. My point is to say that I think Dr. Deming had reasons for why he talked about, why he talked about using single source, why actually, his statement, it's interesting, his statement it only says single supplier at the end. He says, in the practice of awarding business on the basis of price tag alone, instead minimize total cost, all right? So he's got reasons for saying his stuff. And so my point here is, as we start thinking about Dr. Deming's teachings, we should be scratching our heads and saying, why did this guy say that? And how is he looking at the world in a fundamentally different way than the default way that we're looking at the world today? And I would say, even if you don't adopt Dr. Deming's philosophy, it will be of great value if we can start saying, what are the underlying beliefs and assumptions we make in the way we do business today? So let's take a look. I have more of these. So let's eliminate numerical goals and quotas. Let me see. I think I have like one more after that one. So, okay, let's take a look at numerical goals and quotas for a minute. And I'm going to actually do this a little. I'm going to change the order. I couldn't decide what the right order is, so I do it differently every time. Default landscape. Numerical goals and quotas are vital management tools. So can you tell me what the underlying beliefs are that drive our, I mean, maybe you don't believe that, but go ahead.
If I don't give you a goal, you won't do anything.
If you don't have a goal, you won't do anything. Yep.
And it's also used implicit and behind this is fear drives people.
So that fear drives people to do stuff. And so you want to create fear with these goals, not just, and they're going to be stretch goals, because that gets back to they won't do any more than I tell them to do, right? Yes?
It also implies that the manager or person who sets the goals and quotas has enough knowledge to know what the right goal and the right quota is.
Okay.
The outcome is more important than the process.
Ooh, the outcome is the only thing that's important in a lot of cases, right? Anything else? So, go ahead.
It assumes that the boss knows better than the employee.
Right, but so another piece of this, though, that I would say is a real thing that people face. You know, success. One of the things we hear all the time at Polaris, the success. You think about the products we make, and you say through the recession, oh, you guys must have had a really tough time. Our stock price was down to $14 a share in the middle of 2009. And our revenues this year will probably be 40% more than they were in 2009. And our stock price is now $85 after a split. So our stock price has gone from $14 to $170 in 3 years. I don't know how the hell that happened. Actually, I do. There's some magic products we brought to the market that changed the whole game for people. Okay, so where else was I going to go with that? I actually did have a reason for saying that. Default landscape, what's the lens? Oh, I know. One of the things, if we have goals deployed to every department, we can add them up to predict what corporate results will be. So you can imagine the emphasis on quarterly results in my organization have gone through the roof. We've met or exceeded all the investors' expectations for us quarter after quarter. Guess what? The expectations are getting higher and higher and higher. And our management is committed to continuing to meet and exceed those expectations. And, this gives them more predictability if we can deploy, sales and financial goals throughout the organization. So there's some, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's a reason, one of the reasons for deploying goals throughout organizations. Okay, so why would Deming maybe say eliminate numerical goals and quotas? What in the system of profound knowledge might cause a problem there? Go ahead.
If you're going to recognize and reward me based on some number, I'll make that number say whatever it has.
Oh, right. Yeah, and I actually have sort of a slide about this. So if you look at this, the bullet at the bottom says there are 3 ways to achieve a goal. I think Dr. Deming always attributed this to a guy named Brian Joyner from Madison. You can improve the process. That takes a lot of time and effort and is kind of iffy because you never know until the results come in whether you've been effective. You can distort the process to get the result at the expense of something else, or you can distort the measurement. There's other words for that. Okay? So I actually have a story that I can't resist telling you. My story about goals is in 1996, I trained for and ran my first marathon. So it was like December of 1995, and I was like going upstairs, and I'd be winded before I should be. I'd been gaining weight. I was approaching a weight that started with 2, and I swore that would never, ever happen. There's just several things going on. I said, you know what? I'm going to do something. I'm going to exercise it more and eat less. Has anybody in this room ever said that around the first of the year? And how would that go for you? I said, I've said this year after year, and I want to have something that creates urgency for me to do some of these things. So I said, okay. I've actually watched the Twin Cities Marathon go by, which is actually tomorrow, go by several times. We would stop on our way to church, and we'd sit and watch the marathon for half an hour, and then we'd go on. And unfortunately for me, we were watching about mile 12. Because, everybody looks pretty damn good at mile 12. If I'd have watched at mile 24, I might never have run a marathon. But anyway, I watched at mile 12. I thought, that would be really cool. And it's cool for lots of reasons. It seemed like a really neat thing to be a part of. So I said, I'm going to run a marathon. And I had a couple friends who was sort of a convergence. They were going to run marathons too, and we decided to do it. I was going to do Grandma's Marathon in June of 1996. And so I started training, and I got this training plan, and day by day I'd keep track. I'd run a mile, and I'd run 2 miles, or 3 miles. And in February, early February, I ran my first 8-mile run, and the next day my knee hurt. And so I took a couple days off. And actually, I was a little behind my training schedule. And by the way, I decided I was going to run this marathon, and my goal time was going to be 4 hours. So I created a plan to deliver 4 hours. I had a plan, workouts and stuff. And so I was a little behind my plan. So I just sort of pushed to try to catch up. And a couple weeks later, my right ankle was sore. And so I missed a little time. And then a couple weeks later, I was running again, and my left knee was sore. And so it was sort of a disaster going forward from there. It's like I did one 20-mile run, and I did it 3 weeks before my marathon, and walked funny for another week, and only did 2 more runs between then and the marathon. But stupid Mike, I went to do the marathon anyway. I had this goal, you see, and I started running the marathon. It was a beautiful morning. And about mile 4, I almost fell. My right knee kind of buckled, and it's like, oh, that was weird. Anyway, I finished the marathon in 4.5 hours. At the end, there was a guy who actually was running backwards, went by me. I finished the marathon in 4 hours and 25 minutes. I've had way worse times. Bill Bellows can tell you about that. But I was miserable, I was like in tears at the end, and not just because of the accomplishment I made. And so I suffered through the rest of the day, went to bed. The next morning I got out of bed and fell because my knees wouldn't support me. Now you might say, how stupid is this guy, right? I couldn't run for 4 months. So what's the point of all of that? What was my aim? My goal was to run a marathon. See, I had an aim, right? My aim was to not gain weight, to get in better shape, to feel better. Assessing my aim the day after the marathon, I decided I had not achieved my aim. I achieved my goal, but not my aim. So that happens a lot. We honestly translate aims to goals, and then we do stupid things in the name of the goal that gets in the way of the aim. We forget the aim sometimes, and we put the goal in its place. Now, I've since run 15 more marathons, and my aim and goal every time is to finish the marathon and feel good enough at the end to have a beer. Now, I don't always have a beer immediately, but I want to feel. So I've actually run a number of marathons where I went for like a 5-mile run the next morning. So I mean, it's like, it doesn't have to be that way. Don't take this as a apocryphal story and a reason not ever to run a marathon. But anyway, all right, so that's about goals. So I'm going to skip the last example, which is about a merit appraisal, and actually that's the one where Deming actually connected with me in the first place. You can ask questions. So it was interesting. Dick stood up last night, and maybe I shouldn't name names here, but Dick stood up last night and talked about, yeah, we should be striving to get rid of grades, and then the dean stood up and said, some of Deming's stuff I'm not sure about yet. I mean, I think some of what that's saying is, we should talk about what's behind merit appraisals. What are the assumptions behind merit appraisals? What are the assumptions behind grades? Are they doing what we want them to do? Why would we get rid of them? How would we get rid of them? If we just drop grades, by the way, it would be a disaster, I think. There are a lot of people in the system that are addicted to grades. And I'm talking about students as well as like teachers and administrators and stuff. So anyway, but you'll hear more about that this afternoon from David, right? Okay. Let's skip to the end. All right, so the end, my conclusion is, all right, we see the world not the way it is, but the way we are. This goes back to this relativist view, right? I don't believe, so people talk to me about objective data. I don't believe they exist because there are judgments made in what you're going to measure, even if you can defend your measurement method, all right? Dr. Deming, with a system of profound knowledge, has provided us a way to see the world differently. So we have a choice about how we see, so let's make that choice. So this is the end of the survey course. So now you're ready for all the advanced topics courses that are coming. It's 9:31, so can we take any questions, or should we just... Did anybody have any questions or comments? I will be around the whole 2 days if you want to come accost me apart from that. By the way, I've written a little paper about the little parable of the marathon, so I'd be glad to share that with anybody. Go ahead.
So could you say that your system of your body was not prepared for the goal that you set? And you end up causing more damage?
Well, the bottom line there was I'm a pronator. And I didn't know squat about things like pronation. And so I decided that I don't know anybody that really likes those 20-mile training runs, but I like actually going up for 13-mile runs, or running for a couple hours at a time. That wasn't in my kin before. So I actually did some research, and I went to see somebody, and he said, oh, you pronate. And there are shoes you can buy, surprise, surprise, that will help compensate for that. So I went forward without enough process knowledge, as it were, to really do the job right. And by the way, I pulled the plug on other marathons before I ever got to the marathon, or I actually walked off the course of a marathon a couple times because I wasn't, the conditions were hard, it was hot, or, it was something like that. So I've gotten smarter, well, not smart maybe, but smarter in this element. So, yes?
I've learned from some of my colleagues who studied abroad, who
had their education in Europe, where grades are not critical. Why does it take a program like this to convince somebody when there's that history of it?
So why does it take something like this? Well, so part of the deal here is your colleagues or your friends went abroad to study, where guess what? They have a different lens. So it would be interesting to examine what's their lens and how do they see education operating without grades, and how does that fit with our beliefs about education and grades. But don't take it about education, take it about anything. I mean, you know, I believe everybody, every American who can, should go out of the United States and go far away to someplace else and experience life some other place and find out what kind of default lenses other people have and try to do it, you know, and I think you'll probably come back and you'll be less judgmental of others. So, yes?
So I'd like you to go back to slide 13, please.
Oh my gosh, she even has the slide numbers down. Okay.
Because I want this lens to be in your mind as you go through the day.
Oh, you want the lens?
No,
Oh.
slide 13. Okay, so on slide 13, A and B, it says, experience study without theory teaches nothing. I really like that. Is it on? Yeah. So it says experience study without theory teaches nothing. And examples, success stories studied without theory teach nothing. So I will argue that nationally, that those who want to contribute to better student learning, recruitment, retention, success, often dabble without A and B.
So let's do something.
So what I'm saying, and my ears are wide open, okay, is that I would like for us, even, I'm hopeful that I'm not going to hear experiences and gospel without theory and fundamental understanding. That's what I'm challenging for the day and a half, that I would love to hear theory, okay? And then back to the grades. Honestly, grades are nothing more than a way to say, how well did we achieve what it was that we aimed to do, right? And the unfortunate thing is that we're in a system much larger than ourselves. So employers use grades, other universities use grades to decide what level of knowledge did you have, did you actually succeed in, do you know anything, okay? Is it good to be the reward for the student? I fully agree, no, it is not. It's just a measure that others are using to look at how much of that class is full and do you have basic things that are missing. But as far as the reward system goes, and to, you know, how do you show up to a class? Is it because of a grade? Well, that's not very motivational. Is it because there's something really interesting and you quest after that because it's going to help you to achieve some personal goal? That's really what we're after. And I think maybe that's the argument, but.
Yeah, and I think there are lots of conversations about that, and I think it's actually grades it can be a flashpoint for people one way or the other, just like performance appraisals are in businesses. But so some of what we can do is basically we should be saying what are the lenses that we look at education, through which we look at education, and how can we improve education, and what are the things that build education and what are the things that get in the way. And so you know, I think that you could probably find some people who could talk about some negative implications of grades. And so what you're saying is, if we're going to survive in this larger system and it requires grades, if we accept that, then how do we mitigate the negatives of it?
Don't focus on the grades, but again, there's
Right.
a lot of
Right. Yeah.
knowledge out there.
Right, and you know, by the way, Dr. Deming didn't intend, when he had 14 points, he didn't intend for people to pick and choose their favorites, you know. They were sort of, you look at the world and you see this world, and he was trying, I think, to describe the world, and as he saw it. So he wasn't saying, oh yeah, you can do this and leave all that stuff alone. So the key is to let's, you know, dig into the fundamental assumptions behind how we do stuff and why we do stuff and how can we make things improve, and yeah. exactly. I think that that's what it's about. I'll be around for the rest of the time. So if anybody wants to capture me and talk, yeah, I'm fine with that.